But I'm here today to talk about Iran, and I think Ben invited me because of an editorial I wrote with Bill Kristol a couple of weeks ago in the Weekly Standard called A Period of Consequences, where we were trying to lay out the argument for a renewed public debate about the military option against Iran to prevent it from acquiring nuclear weapons. So I want to go through a little bit how, at least in my mind, I can't stand here and speak for Bill entirely, how we got to that point where we think we should consider military action. I think it's especially important to start off with kind of an assessment of where the Obama administration is today on Iran policy. Some people, I think here in town, are trying to argue that the Obama administration has actually made some very positive steps and showed some strength on this issue in recent weeks. We've had a new UN Security Council resolution. We've had the president sign into law strong congressional legislation, and their rhetoric has certainly been tougher than it has been for much of the first year and a half of the administration. I would say I'm very skeptical, though, of that argument that they have finally seen the light and are willing to do everything required to prevent a nuclear Iran. And one thing that came out this week I think is worth looking at. It's an interview with John Lindbergh, who was the head of the Iran office, literally wrote the book on how to negotiate with Iran, who is now leaving the State Department. And in an interview with Foreign Policy magazine, he just described the most recent sanctions by saying, sanctions were never supposed to become an end in themselves, but unfortunately they can easily become so because they are something we know how to do, Lindbergh said. Changing relations with Iran is much harder than imposing sanctions, particularly if the other side is not going to be very cooperative. You can clearly see the sense still at the State Department, in the Bureau that helps determine our Iran policy, that the real goal is just improving relations with Iran. Sanctions are merely a tool that they'd like to use to get Iran back to the negotiating table. So I think despite some of these recent actions, we need to be wary of the Obama administration's intentions on this issue. Now, that said, as someone who served in the Bush administration, including at the NSC in the final year of the administration working on Iran policy, quite frankly, the Bush administration failed in terms of an effort to prevent a nuclear Iran. I think we need to admit that. I think it's worth starting off by looking at maybe why the Bush administration failed. It's a number of factors. First, it was a flawed 2007 national intelligence estimate, which the White House, in my sense, was unwilling to push back against, even though many of us working on this issue had some strong concerns at the time. But this was an administration that had battled the intelligence community for much of its tenure, especially after Iraq, and there was an unwillingness to have another fight over this issue. There was also a preoccupation with other problems, getting Iraq right finally, Afghanistan that was increasingly looking to become a dire situation. And then there was also just a genuine, especially from the State Department, I think, obsession with diplomatic options, particularly the P5+1 mechanism, and the thought that we might actually be able to get Russia and China on board with some sort of serious action against Iran. So that left us at the end of 2008, I think, with Iran clearly having made significant progress on its enrichment program at its key facility at Natanz. I think most of us who kind of turned out the lights at the end of the Bush administration assumed that the Obama administration would come in with all of its talk of engagement and go to the European allies and basically say, we are going to reach out to Iran just like you wanted the Bush administration to, but before we do that, we want you to actually pass tough sanctions that will force them to talk to us. Unfortunately, the administration did not do that. They waited 6 months, did a policy review, sent a few letters to the supreme leader, and they made no effort to get the Europeans to take any action. And I think the resulting failure is in large part due to that delay. Now, the administration was put in an awkward position when the fraudulent elections of last June led to massive protests against the very people that they wanted to sit down and talk to. And that's why we saw the horrible rhetoric, I think, from the president in the aftermath of June 12th, where he was even unwilling to speak out in support of the Iranian people. Last fall, they had the opportunity to reveal the secret enrichment facility at Qom, and I would argue that they actually bungled the release of that information as well. President Sarkozy and other allies wanted to do it in a very grand manner at the UN Security Council. The president insisted on waiting until the next day at the G20, and I really think that a revelation like that clearly showed to the world that Iran was up to its old tricks could have been used for much more mileage than we actually got. The saga continued last year with discussions in Geneva where it appeared that Iran might have agreed to swap some of its low-enriched uranium and transfer it out of the country, but that soon fell apart. And that eventually, over the course of months and months of negotiations, led to the somewhat weak and watered-down sanctions that we've seen in recent months, and then the congressional legislation, which, while good, I would argue, is still does not go as far as it could in terms of actually pressuring Iran. I'd say in terms of the current situation and where we stand, my current fear is that I think this administration, like I said, is trying to use sanctions to sanction the Iranians back to the negotiating table, and this renewed talk of another deal with Brazil and Turkey has now reared its head again. And my personal concern is that at some point this year or next, we may see the Obama administration actually take the Brazilians and Turks up on that offer. There's some indication of their willingness to do that in President Obama's letter to Brazilian President Lula, which was leaked by the angry Brazilians after they thought they had concluded a good deal with the Iranians, and then the administration distanced themselves from Brazil. But I really think that's where this whole process may be headed. So on that note, I quickly want to go through, I know a number of the people in the room follow this issue closely, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but the current program, kind of as I see it, obviously the three main things we need to be concerned about with the Iranian nuclear program are whether they can manufacture the fissile material, whether they can develop the delivery vehicle to deliver a nuclear weapon, and then whether they actually can weaponize the nuclear material. On the first part, production of fissile material, we saw Iran earlier this year cross what I would say is what should have been a red line and now enrich up to 20%, which is troubling because as they get higher and higher, it becomes easier and easier for them to produce highly enriched uranium. I would note that one thing we've often seen the administration try to play down Iran's capabilities. They did this after President Ahmadinejad announced in February that they had enriched up to 20%. It later turned out from IAEA reports that the administration was incorrect and Ahmadinejad was actually correct. We've also seen them try to highlight through leaks in the press supposed intelligence community sabotage or Israeli sabotage supposedly working. I would just caution people to be very skeptical of those sorts of accounts, regardless of whatever sabotage might be occurring. The fact of the matter is Iran is producing significant quantities of LEU, of low-enriched uranium, and I think they've gotten to the point where they've clearly mastered enrichment technology. So regardless of whether they're producing HEU right now, they certainly know how to operate the centrifuges, even if some may crash from time to time. The other thing we've seen clearly are advances in Iran's missile program. We've seen them put satellites into orbit, and that's the sort of technology with a satellite launch vehicle that can be converted into an intercontinental ballistic missile, which one day might be able to threaten the U.S. homeland. And even as we've seen those sorts of activities, this administration, in canceling the Bush administration's plans for missile defense sites in Europe and going with a different approach, has played down the threat to the U.S. homeland, at least in the near term, and claimed that the thing we should be concerned about are short and medium-range missiles from Iran. Perhaps most concerning in terms of just the status of the program have been press reports that weaponization work has resumed, and this is was supposedly the big finding from the 2007 NIE was that there was a halt in weaponization activities after 2003. For a long time, the Israelis have been skeptical about that claim, and the press reports at least now indicate that even the U.S. intelligence community is rethinking that assessment and that there may be ongoing weaponization work. The latest reports from the International Atomic Energy Agency certainly lead in that direction and have been quite alarmist. So there's supposedly a new NIE in the works, as many of you know, but it keeps on getting delayed, so it's unclear when that question is going to be resolved, at least internally within the U.S. government. All of this noted about the current program, I will say that I'm not personally convinced that the Supreme Leader or other Iranian leaders have basically told their scientists to go full speed ahead towards a nuclear weapon at this point. General Hayden, former director of the CIA, has said on a number of occasions to the press that his concern is that they're going to get right to the threshold and linger there, and that I guess that's my assessment as well. I think that that's actually perhaps even more dangerous than them going full speed ahead, because As long as they're at that threshold, there are going to be those in Europe and those here in the U.S. that are going to argue that we've got plenty of time, that we've got another couple years, and that we don't need to think about taking drastic action like the military option. And so I'm a bit concerned that the Iranians are smart enough to see that that's in their best interest. All of this leads to, I think, or should lead to a discussion of, so what action should we take? I've been pretty negative about sanctions. I'm not completely opposed to sanctions. I think they certainly have a role. I guess I would have liked to see the administration take some stronger Treasury actions, like taking what's called Section 311 action against Iran, which declares it a country of money laundering concern, basically has the impact of shutting it off from the rest of the world's economy. We could designate the Iranian Central Bank, which would have similar implications for Iran. My fear is that I just don't think any of the sanctions on the table, any of the sanctions discussed at the UN, any of the European sanctions are actually going to change the regime's calculus and cause them to stop the nuclear program. I think the only thing that would clearly put off the nuclear program would be something along the lines of regime change, which in the wake of June 12th, some of us had hoped that an opposition movement would be powerful enough to possibly head in that direction, but at least in recent months, it appears that the regime has asserted more control, and the opposition has not been able to generate the large-scale protests that they were last year. We actually, I think, passed out a paper that we did earlier this year on the fact sheet on the Green Movement. But I think at this point, we can't hope that regime change will occur before we actually have to be concerned about an Iranian nuclear weapon. So those two options set aside, I think the administration clearly needs to reassert that it will not accept a nuclear Iran, because I'm a bit concerned that some of the administration think that a nuclear Iran could be contained. Clearly, there would be proliferation of nuclear weapons in the Middle East if Iran goes nuclear. Clearly, it would embolden them as given their support for terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. And I think it would also send a message to others in the world who look to the U.S. In terms of our nuclear umbrella and our alliances, and would undermine confidence in American leadership in the world. I think we do need to be exploring the military option. I think it's better if the U.S. takes action rather than Israel. Some people have called for Israel to take action. I think that would be a sad state of affairs if the U.S. cannot actually deal with this really global security threat and has to rely on Israel. Israel is not as well suited to take action against Iran as we are in terms of the number of its planes, their reach, their refueling capability. I think only the U.S. Air Force is really in that position. And on that note, I'd actually recommend that you check out the Bipartisan Policy Center's recent reports on this, which have been fantastic, I think, in kind of exploring these scenarios. What would military action entail? I mean, I'm not a military planner, but I would say that I think it would clearly involve multiple nuclear sites over a prolonged period of time, not just 1 or 2 days. I would also argue that given the way Iran has acted towards the U.S. in the region, the fact of the matter is Iran has the blood of American men and women in uniform on its hands from both Iraq and Afghanistan. There's no reason we should also not target IRGC kind of command elements, training depots where insurgents in Iraq and elsewhere have been trained and weapons have been prepared for shipment to be used against the U.S. This is not the sort of thing where we need to think about military action to take down the Iranian regime, but I do think it would send a strong message to Iran and make the regime rethink some of its actions. In conclusion, I'd say the one hope I have that the Obama administration may come around on this issue and may even think about military or explore the military option is the priority they've placed on nonproliferation and disarmament. This has been something the president is clearly personally invested in. He sees it as a legacy issue. And the fact of the matter is if Iran goes nuclear on his watch, he will have no ability to claim success on the nonproliferation and disarmament front. The problem, I'd say, with a lot of his focus on nonproliferation is it hasn't actually dealt with the real problem cases like Iran and North Korea. He's focused on reducing Russian nuclear weapons, which were going to be reduced anyways. He's held a nuclear security summit with countries like Ukraine and Canada pledging to give up fissile material, which we should be concerned about, but not certainly at the level of what's going on in Iran. And he's vested a lot of faith in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Iran is violating. And we got a final document out of that review conference a couple months ago, which criticized Israel and didn't even mention Iran once. So I think this policy has certainly been misguided, but I do hope that in the end, if the president really cares about that agenda, he may eventually feel forced to focus a little bit more on the threat of a nuclear Iran. I just end by saying no one wants another war, certainly given what we're currently committed to in Afghanistan, and even as we draw down in Iraq. But I do think we need to seriously explore the military option, because I think the results of a nuclear Iran would be truly unacceptable. Thanks.